Hello and welcome to a special ICC program that features a one-time induction of 10 great players into the ICC Hall of Fame to coincide with the first ever final of the World Test Championship in England in June 2021. This is a celebration of these players who have made a significant contribution to Test cricket in the history of Test cricket and during 5 specifically selected time periods. Now, we're going to go back a long way to the early cricket era, pre-1918, the interwar era, 1918 and 1945, the post-war period from 1946 to 1970, moving on then to the ODI era, 1971 to 1995, and finishing with the modern cricket era, 96 to 2016. We're going to be in the company of VIPs, and we're going to be looking at these 10 inductees into this special edition. So let's firstly introduce you to two of our VIPs who will be joining us throughout this program. Lisa Sthalekar, a recent inductee into the ICC Hall of Fame, and Lawrence Booth, leading cricket and sports writer in England and editor of the Wisden Almanac. Lisa, for you, as a recent inductee into the ICC Hall of Fame, what does it mean, having had a career in cricket and then to be recognised into the ICC Hall of Fame?
Well, firstly, it's a great privilege. When you first take up the game, you play for the love of it. You want to do well for your country. And then you've got an ability to win trophies, win series. But the main thing is that you never kind of think about these individual awards. So to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, it's extremely special.
And Lawrence, for you, and of course you've been with Wisden for many years now, for the modern player, how important is it for the youngsters or young players to know the history and to know who the great players have been in our sport?
Well, I think the poet John Donne said, "No man is an island," and I think that applies to Test cricket. It's a grand historical continuum. If you know about the past, you may be more likely to enjoy the present. Lots of Test teams now put a number on the Test cap that's awarded. You are number 675 to play for England, so you're reminded of your place in the overall scheme. And I think it goes beyond sort of creating a family and a cricket family and nostalgia. We often talk about, is this the best batsman since Bradman, or can England find the new Ian Botham? You know, these discussions are always placed in a historical context. You may be inspired by a previous player. You may learn about the first guy who bowled a googly back in the first decade of the 20th century and decide that that's what you want to do too. So I think it always helps to know that others have gone before you and that you can follow in their footsteps.
Well, let's start then with the early cricket era. This is pre-1918 and our first inductee. South Africa's Aubrey Falconer, a sad life in many respects. His life ended early and he came through the horrors of war and the Second Boer War, but in amongst all that, he played cricket and he was one of the pioneers of the googly and wrist spin, and it was a wrist spin quartet for South Africa that really held sway over England in those early years. Lisa, I'm going to bring you in here. To be such a foremost spinner in the world when probably it wasn't vogue in those days, how difficult is it to master a craft such as spin?
Well, you've also got to remember that he was playing for South Africa, which was one of the weakest sides playing Test cricket at that time. So he was always playing against tough opposition. And it seemed, based on his statistics, that he enjoyed that he absolutely revelled in it. And whilst, you know, the wrist spin was part of his game, he was known at the time as one of the best all-rounders in Test cricket. So it is a shame that war and health really got to shorten his career, because it would have been nice to see what he would have been able to produce if he was able to play plenty more tests.
Yeah, Lawrence, bringing you in here as well, as Lisa says, he was a heck of a bat as well. He was regarded as the leading all-rounder of his time, the first South African to score a double century in Test cricket. I mean, these people, without going too down a morbid track here, what they had to endure in life in war times and yet they managed to play cricket. It must have been one of life's great conundrums.
Yeah, I guess it gave them a certain perspective. They knew that cricket wasn't everything. There was a lot more going on, and perhaps it freed them up in some ways. You got that double hundred at the MCG in 1910-11 when he was a series in which he passed 57 times with the bat, and as you mentioned, a pioneer with the googly. So he was experimenting. He was having some fun with his game. And South Africa, as Lisa mentioned, were weak at the time. There was a series in 1905-06 when South Africa played England. They hadn't won a single series against England, let alone a single test match. And they beat them 4-1 because they suddenly everyone decided to start bowling googlies. They had 4 googly bowlers in their team, and Falconer led the way in that. He was a kind of matinee idol in some ways. They used to say that women used to go to games just to watch him. He was blonde and tall and good looking, and he could do everything really. And as you say, that the shadow of war hanging over him, which has added some poignancy to the story.
A life in cricket that ended way too soon for Aubrey Falconer. His life ended in London after discovering and building up a cricket school that was the home for cricket for so many young players. Now we'll move on to our second inductee into the pre-cricket era. This is pre-war, 1918, and let's see who this is. Monty Noble, who was one of 8 brothers. The parents moved from Surrey in England. They emigrated to Australia, and England's loss was very much Australia's gain. But what a player, what an all-rounder he was. Lawrence, bringing you in here for the historical perspective. He was, in fact, the Wisden Cricketer of the Year in 1900, but he was the true all-rounder, batsman, bowler, fielder, and innovative captain. This guy did it all. He
did the lot, yeah. We often don't necessarily think of Australia as a great producer of test all-rounders, but Noble was one of the first. As you say, he could do the lot. And captaincy was, let's start with that. He captained Australia to Ashes wins both home and away, which puts him on a pantheon not many have achieved in the past. He once took 13 wickets in a test match at the MCG. He bowled off spin and medium pace, so it was almost foreshadowing Gary Sobers, many decades later, who could bowl spin and medium pace. And he was a giant, really. Played in sort of 42 tests or so, and was regarded as one of the first great all-rounders, setting the template for guys who followed him later, likes of Keith Miller, maybe into the modern era, going to Shane Watson. So he was the first of that sort of lineage. And Lisa, what's apparent during Monty Noble's career was that he had this strong association with the Paddington Club in Sydney. It seemed then that the association with clubs, affiliation with clubs, was very prominent then. He was a banker, ended up as a dentist, but it was this great affiliation with the club is that still prevalent today in modern Australia?
Yes, certainly all the test stars will still remember, and wasn't that long ago that still Australian test players used to come back and play, one club match a season. So their club side is, especially in Australia, was seen as the breeding ground. And in New South Wales during that time, you had so many legends within the game that were playing. It's great to kind of probably read a little bit more about Monty Noble, because as a New South Wales player, you kind of go and play at the SCG and you see the stands, the Noble stand, and to kind of have a look at his life and see what he was able to achieve. He is a giant within the game. He still holds the fastest player for the double of 1,000 runs and 100 test wickets, which I think he took about 27 test matches. So to still have a statistic like that just shows you the class that he was able to have.
Wonderful insight there of the SCG as well. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks very much indeed. I've actually been in the Noble stand, and you've taught me a little bit of history that wasn't quite in my almanac. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move on now to the next period in history that we're looking at. This is the interwar era, 1918 to 1945. Once again, 2 inductees. Let's introduce you to our first. Sir Leary Constantine, Test cricketer, lawyer, barrister, and politician, and a legacy that he left not just for cricket but for life. He was a pioneer for race relations. He was a key man whose life ended in the United Kingdom. I'd like to bring Lawrence here now once again. Sir Leary Constantine, Lawrence, wasn't just a cricketer. His life very quickly transferred into an area of politics, and he had a huge influence on people's lives.
That's right. He straddled both sides of the Atlantic, really. Grandson of a slave, grew up in Trinidad and then came over to England, played several seasons for Nelson in the Lancashire League. In fact, Nelson won 8 out of 10 Lancashire Leagues while he was there, which was an unprecedented rate of success, and that was basically down to Constantine. And he suffered racial abuse. It took him a long time to be accepted in Lancashire, but it forged a strength within him, a desire to change things. He was infamously refused entry to a hotel in London, he and his family, because of the colour of his skin, and partly on the basis of that, he set about putting together the Race Relations Act of 1965, which helped formalise anti-racial ideas in the UK, and he later became the first black member of the House of Lords. So he was a giant on the pitch. I mean, his test stats don't quite back that up. He was an incredibly entertaining player, but what he did for the game after his retirement was astonishing, and he's one of those players who really does transcend cricket, probably as much as any player in the history of the game has done.
I want to pick up some of your points there, Lawrence, with Lisa. Lisa, all that Lawrence talked about there, you'd almost think that it happened 20 years ago, but this was in the 1920s. This is when he made his Test debut in 1928. He actually took the first West Indies Test wicket for the West Indies. But I mean, all this happened from Sir Leary Constantine all those years ago. It makes you wonder about the enormous stature of this man.
Yeah, it takes someone who's very secure within themselves to be able to stand up against establishment, to be able to fight for a cause, not only for yourself, but for the whole of humanity, basically. And you think of back then, the issues that he was facing. Unfortunately, we're still facing them now, but someone needed to start, and obviously he did. And as Lawrence said, he certainly transcended the sporting field, and what he was able to do off has probably outshined what he was able to do on the field. But he was the first real all-rounder of the West Indian greats, and they've been able to produce so many, but he was the first of many from that area.
Yeah, we are talking about the interwar era, 1918 to 1945, and we'll move on now to our second inductee from this specific period. Stan Mckay, one of the greatest batsmen of all time, and described by Wisden as one of Australia's greatest and most enterprising batsmen, and by his captain, Don Bradman, as one of the greatest batsmen of the game. Well, accolades really don't come much higher than that. He was never dropped from the Australian Test team, and I know that Ian Chappell, former great Australian captain, rated Mckay as, on his day, even better than the great Don Bradman. Food for thought there for you, Lawrence Booth, who's the current editor of Wisden. I mean, those words are extraordinarily powerful in terms of describing the talent of Stan Mckay.
Absolutely. Bradman himself was dropped famously after his first couple of tests. So Mckay never was, and he played a couple of all-time great innings, and after one of them, which was at Trent Bridge in 1938, when he scored 232 off about 270 balls and absolutely took England apart, he came back into the dressing room, and Bradman was there waiting for him, and he shook his hand and he said something to the effect of what I would give to be able to play an innings like that. I mean, Bradman averaged twice as much as Mckay. He averaged twice as much as pretty well everyone. But Mckay was this riveting batsman to watch. He used to go for it. The other sort of all-time Hall of Fame innings that he played was at the start of the Bodyline series, 32-33, when of course England had devised these tactics to bounce Australia with a leg side field. No limits in those days as to how many men you could have behind square on the leg side. And Mckay hit 187 not out in the first game. I think the next highest score was Vic Richardson's 49. He did it without a helmet, don't forget, against some fast bowlers trying to pepper his rib cage and his head. Scored mainly on the leg side, as you'd expect, but that was a sensational effort. Australia lost that game by 10 wickets, and Mckay scored 187 not out. So he was an amazing player, and it was one of those sort of tragic stories in the end that his career was interrupted by the Second World War. Didn't play a test match after 1938 when he was still in his prime, and who knows what kind of numbers and entertainment he would have provided had war not intervened.
You spoke about the fact that 232 runs, that was scored in less than 4 hours. So you think now, would we ever see something like that in this modern era? I don't know. But that type of ability shown at that time, you just kind of go, wow, I wish we had a lot of footage of him. Yeah, there's also another innings, and he was probably well known for the fact that when Australia was down, he was the type of player to really stand up. He was known for his quick footwork, his hooking ability, which probably you saw that in the Bodyline series when he scored that 187 not out. But another example was his test in Johannesburg in 1935. Australia was set an impossible 399 to win. And he reached 189 of an Australian total of 274. So it just shows you that he was the type of player that I'm sure everyone stopped what they were doing to either go to the ground to watch it or to listen to the wireless.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Lisa, because it was the South African captain in that test match, Herbie Wade, who appealed against the light to the umpires because he said that Mckay was making life difficult for his fielders.
He was hitting it too hard. It was too hard. They couldn't see the ball. Can you believe it?
Yeah. Unbelievable scenario that. And also Clary Grimmett, one of Australia's greatest spinners, also was of the opinion that he regarded Mckay as technically superior to Bradman more often than not. So the adulation for the great Stan Mckay of Australia is astounding, and it's well worth a read about his wonderful career. We're going to move on now. We're going through the ages. This is the post-war period from 1946 to 1970, obviously straight after the Second World War, and 2 inductees. Here is our first. Ted Dexter, who is affectionately known as Lord Ted. My goodness, what an influence he had on not just cricket, but a lot of sport. He was an absolutely wonderful golfer. I think he liked racing motor cars as well. Captain of Sussex when they won the first 2 domestic English competitions. Ian Chappell said, his opinion, Ted Dexter hit the ball as hard as anyone he ever played against. Lawrence, I'm coming to you because in Wisden, there's a line I just picked out, that there was no more exhilarating sight in English cricket than Ted Dexter when he was savaging fast bowling. And that's what he did so well.
That's right. He scored quite a few test centuries, but perhaps the innings that is often spoken about is Lord's 1963 against West Indies, Hall and Griffiths, and England were in trouble. They lost a couple of early wickets, and he counter-attacked in a way that people tended not to in the 1960s. He got 70. By the time he was out, the score had only advanced to 103, so he dominated. And it was one of those cameos that people still talk about. It was Lord Ted at his finest. As you say, he did all sorts of things. He was a scratch golfer. He sometimes got bored of cricket, weirdly. He once missed a tour of South Africa because he wanted to stand for Parliament. Didn't win the seat, standing in Cardiff South East, I think it was, against Jim Callaghan, which probably wasn't a great move. Fairly powerful Labour politician, and he lost. But Dexter was a Renaissance man. He could do everything, and in full flow, one of the greatest sights in English cricket.
It's a lovely summary of his career, and there's so much to Ted Dexter. Lisa, he was instrumental in designing the rankings for Test cricketers that we're using these days. Ted was ahead of his game. I'm not asking you to think of a modern player who's of this ilk, but again, it's the kind of legacy that these great players like Ted Dexter had on our game.
Yeah, I guess you look at all of the ICC Hall of Famers and you can see the impact that they've had on the game, on the field. And obviously their statistics and cricket is led by numbers first and foremost. But I'm sure that the committee also consider the legacy. What have they been able to do to ensure that they've left the game in a better place? And Ted Dexter was certainly one of those. He, as you mentioned, had the foresight to kind of put together ranking systems, which now the ICC use. So it's these type of players that are really our base, our platform, where we've now been able to really grow the game.
Absolutely. So Ted Dexter, Lord Ted, our first inductee in the post-war era. We're talking 1946 to 1970. Let's move on now to introduce you to our second from this period. The great Vinoo Manka, Malvantrai Manka, but Vinoo was his schoolboy nickname and Vinoo stuck. The man from Jamnagar in Gujarat. Lisa, this man is still talked about by the likes of Sunil Gavaskar, still talked about in 2021. This man had such an effect on Indian cricket, on world cricket. How much do you know about the great Vinoo Manka?
He played in an era where, the names of Vijay Hazare, which is part of the Indian domestic competition, absolute legends of the game. But Vinoo Manka and what he was able to achieve in those 44 tests just shows you that his ability, not only as an opening batter, but a left-arm spinner. He used his conditions really well, a wonderful stroke maker. And his name, unfortunately, in this day and age is kind of thought from a negative term. And I know Sunil Gavaskar is all about trying to change the name of being run out at the non-strikers end. But his name is synonymous in Indian cricket and what they were able to do in that generation.
He was an incredibly versatile player. There are only three, I'll give you a wisdom stat here, there are only three players in the history of Test cricket who have batted in every single position, 1 to 11. Sid Gregory of Australia, Wilfred Rhodes of England, and Vinoo Manka. Astonishing, really, to think that he did everything. I mean, he majored as an opener, really, and did pretty well. Got a couple of hundreds at the MCG on India's 47-48 tour there. A terrific 180 odd at Lords, and then against New Zealand at home in the mid-50s scored 2 double hundreds. So that's, before we get on to the 12 wickets he took against England in a test in Madras, as it was then, Chennai now, 13 against Pakistan. He was an absolute giant of the game. And deserves to be remembered for far more than, as Lisa mentioned, someone being run out at the non-strikers end for backing up too far, which, by the way, they shouldn't do.
Absolutely. It would be wonderful to have a comment from Sunil Gavaskar, but that could be a long program. But we will get that. That may be for a future edition of ICC Cricket Hall of Fame. But we will move on now to the next period in our Test history. This is the ODI era. A little bit of a play on those words, but this is 1971 to 1995, and we'll introduce you now to our first inductee from this period. It's difficult just to say Desmond Haynes, because when you say it, you want to say Gordon Greenwich, because Greenwich and Haynes, it just goes together, because these two were the most terrifying opening partnership in Test cricket history. And as a bowler, you more often than not came off the receiving end. Lawrence, you would have seen a lot of Desmond Haynes. Not only did he play West Indies, he played a lot of cricket for Middlesex as well, but there was a solid muscularity about his game, and you had the dashing stroke play at the other end from Greenwich as well. I mean, for bowlers, it was a nightmare.
Yes, it was a nightmare. The great era of West Indian success, we often think that it was based mainly on the various quartets of fast bowlers they had, plus Viv Richards. Well, actually, it was rather more than that. It was, as you say, Haynes and Greenwich. They often say that the best opening partnerships have contrasts, and the most basic contrast is often regarded as a right-left-handed partnership. But both Haynes and Greenwich were right-handers, and as you point out, I think it was their differing styles that really spooked the bowlers. Haynes was, I mean, he was better than solid. I mean, he was solid, but he could also take attacks apart and was an excellent one-day batsman in an era when people were still finding their way in that form of the game. Scored 5 Test hundreds against Australia, 5 against England. He enjoyed playing those sides, and he was combative. He had the bit between his teeth, and a great competitor, if not quite as dashing as Greenwich, but still absolutely crucial to that era of West Indian cricket.
And Lisa, earlier, and you mentioned the Noble stand at the SCG. When you go to Bridgetown, when you go to the Constantine Noble, you'll see the Greenwich stand, the Haynes stand, the Garner, and the Marshall. And it almost gives you goosebumps when you just look up and see these names, that they're so great was their legacy on the game of cricket.
Yeah, and as for me, as a young girl, I grew up watching the West Indies, and this was a time when they were really dominant as well. Desmond Haynes and Gordon Greenwich, and I think they scored 1,600 opening run partnerships. So it just shows you that wasn't all about the bowlers, it was the batters as well that were doing the job. But as we've mentioned, in the one-day cricket, he was able to score a century in his first game, and his last game he was also able to finish off with a century. Just shows you that his skill and his class was able to stay throughout his career. And when you think of that West Indian side, that period of time when they dominated, he's one of the names that you put up there with all the fast bowlers.
Absolutely right. And he did become a director of the West Indies Cricket Board and a senator in the Barbados Parliament. And when he speaks, I think you listened, just as when you were a fielder, when his bat flashed, you watched. We're moving on to our second inductee in the ODI era. Talking bowlers, we're moving on towards bowlers. That'll just give you a clue into our next inductee. Bob Willis, sadly no longer with us. He passed away in December 2019. I've read so many descriptions of Bob, tall, angular, awkward, menacing, and that's not talking about his acerbic commentary. That was him as a bowler. Lawrence, over the years, Bob Willis, and we've heard about all the knee surgeries that he had, that he bowled in constant pain, but his record, which was a record at the time, 325 wickets at 25, he was right at the top of his game. And especially during that 81 Ashes series at Headingley, that was his moment, wasn't it?
It was. That 81 Headingley match is often associated with Ian Botham for his 149 not out, which actually gave England a total to defend, but they were still only defending about 130. That was not a gimme win for England, far from it. And Australia got to about 50 for 1 before Willis changed ends, ran down the Kirkstall Lane end, and was like a man possessed, 8 for 43, and Australia all out for 111. And he was doing that on, you mentioned his knees. His knees were very wonky at the time, and he'd been written off ahead of that game by the English press. There's a famous interview he does afterwards where he gets stuck into the press. Actually, he still looks like he's in a trance, and he almost bowled throughout in a trance in that innings. It was typical Bob. Once he got on a roll, he was hard to stop. 325 Test wickets these days doesn't sound like a lot, does it? I mean, last summer we had Jimmy Anderson going to 600, Stuart Broad to 500, but in those days getting to 300 was pretty special. Only 3 guys had done it before Bob Willis: Fred Truman, Lance Gibbs, the West Indian off-spinner, and Dennis Lillee. So he was in exalted company, and he took those Test wickets at an average of 25, which is exceptional. It's better than Anderson and Broad. He was an all-time great for England. We sometimes forget that because he played alongside Ian Botham, but Bob Willis was right up there.
I remember 2017, I was fortunate enough to actually interview him. And I remember asking around the commentary box, I've got to interview Bob Willis, and they're like, good luck. And I'm thinking, oh dear, what have I got myself into? And I remember going up, it was at Adelaide Oval, we went to a separate area. And he was so lovely, and I could have spent a couple of hours talking to him about the game, his theories, how things were going obviously in the series at that time, but he was such a wonderful person just to bounce things off, and no doubt everyone within the commentary box, even though he did polarize quite a few people and certainly spectators, at least you knew where you stood, and at least you knew what he felt about the game.
I just wanted to also ask you there, Lisa, as well. I just wondered whether you touched upon captaincy with Bob, because he was from that rare breed of fast bowling captains. Bob was captain in 18 Test matches for England. You know, Wasim Akram captained Pakistan, so did Mckay Yunus on occasion, and Courtney Walsh for West Indies. Why don't we have more fast bowlers as captains?
Well, if you ask the fast bowling cartel, they'll say, well, absolutely we can. And there has been a wonderful discussion probably here with the Australian cricket team whether Pat Cummins may potentially be the next Test captain. I guess the discussion goes around, are they fit enough to stay on the park? Can they play every match within a series? I guess we'll wait and see as we move forward, but predominantly history has shown us that the batters, the top order, are more likely to be captains.
Maybe that'll change, we'll see. We're going to move on now to our final period of cricket. This, of course, is the modern cricket era from 1996 to 2016, and our introduction to our two inductees. Two giants of the game, both wicketkeeper batsmen, both left-handers, and the records just flow. This would be a different program, another program, just to go through their stats. But Kumar Sangakkara is in London, and in Abu Dhabi we have Andy Flower. Going to come to you first, Andy. Just reading about you, the word patient, I don't know, just came up with me that you exuded patience, because my word, you batted for hours and hours and hours. What was key for you in your career?
I'm not sure some of the players I've worked with would echo those words about patience in my role as a coach these days. But I suppose it was part of Test batting at that time, and still is, that you've got to choose your risk and reward decisions wisely, and I always viewed myself as less physically talented than a lot of the guys that were playing the game at the time, and I thought that my decision making and my patience and I suppose a level of grittiness when you're out there fighting for your country was really important. And I suppose perhaps that's why people might regard patience as being part of my batting makeup.
Sanga, let's come to you, because I mean, we talk about batting a long time. You were involved with that ridiculous partnership of 624 with your good friend Mahela Jayawardene. What drove you on to bat for so long, for so many, 11 scores over 200? I know your highest score was 319, but you and Andy Flower with 232 not out was the highest score for a wicketkeeper in Test cricket. You got the 230. But what drove you on, essentially, with the bat in your hand?
I hated fielding. I loved batting. Wilco, that would be the best way to describe it, and it'll be very, very true. Much like Andy and what Andy said, you know, when I played Test cricket, even though it was not too long ago when I first started, it was a lot about patience, batting long, grinding the opposition down, and making bowlers bowl long spells. I slowly graduated from that, of course, to batting to score runs, and that kind of freed up my fatigue issues around trying to bat long. But I think when you get that experience of training really well, training with a plan, and then taking that into a game, you find a method that works for yourself. And then once you have that method, you add or take away from it at training, and you change with conditions, with opposition, and the stage of your career, and you basically rinse and repeat that, and that really worked well for me.
I just wanted to ask, actually, both of you, now that you're inducted into the ICC Hall of Fame, have you spent a bit of time reflecting on your career? And is there a special innings, one that really stands out for both of you?
Lisa, Yeah, there is for me. The innings that really stands out for me was actually a partnership with my brother in 1995 against Pakistan in Harare, which is probably obviously one of my favorite grounds. But my brother and I came together, I think we were about 45 for 3 after winning the toss and batting. And we ended up, Grant got a double 100, I got 150. And we got a first innings score that sort of set the foundation for our first ever test win. And that, I think, is the innings that I enjoyed the most. It was really testing. Wasim Akram was at the peak of his powers at the time. And we were in trouble. And I ended up batting with Grant which made it particularly special. But it set up a situation where the Pakistanis were under a lot of pressure, and we got our first test win. And the importance of that test win for Zimbabwe at the time was really significant. We'd been playing international cricket for 3 years, and this monkey on our back that's certainly how I felt. It was really significant to dislodge it. We were always struggling to justify our status in the international game, and this was a stepping stone towards doing that. So that inning stands out for me.
For me, in terms of looking back at my career or whatever, I haven't really had the time or the inclination really to look back. I had very happy with the time I retired. I don't have any memorabilia at home, Lisa. Not even a single bat, unfortunately, from my playing days. To really, kind of make me look at them or remind me of the 15 years I played cricket. But in terms of innings, various times, personally for me in Test cricket, my second series in South Africa, I wasn't really sure I was going to make the grade, but I scored 98. Being the last man out, having had to open the innings in the second innings in the Centurion Test match, I think in the year 2000. That's when I thought, batting against a fantastic pace attack that had Donald, Pollock, Cully Sintini, that maybe I was actually good enough to play Test cricket. That was my 6th Test match. So personally, that was quite good. And then in T20 cricket, I think it's a very special innings. Was 2014 knock in the World Cup finals that got us home, which was very satisfying after having been in 4 other World Cup finals and not converting any one of those to a win. So that was very satisfying from a team and country perspective. But there have been so many others along the way, but those 2 really stand out.
Lawrence, get a comment from you. We're talking to 2 of the greatest wicketkeeper batsmen here in Kumar and Andy. And around the world right now, especially in England, there's a wealth of really attractive stroke-playing wicketkeepers. And the England job, you never know who's going to be the wicketkeeper batsman these days because there are so many. But what can modern wicketkeeper batsmen learn from Andy Flower and Kumar Sangakkara?
Well, Andy, we spoke earlier about Aubrey Falconer, a pioneer of the game with his googly. Andy was, I hope he's not doesn't feel to embarrass me saying this, but a bit of a pioneer with some of his stroke play. The reverse sweep was a stroke at the time that was regarded as still quite high risk. It's now played brilliantly by players all over the world, but that was, it seemed from afar, looking on, an attempt to do something different, disrupt the bowlers, change the field. It's often coming in at 7. Andy came in higher than that, but the wicketkeeper's traditional position at 7, you may need to take an innings by the scruff of the neck. You may need to do something different. What Andy did then was, I guess, what was something pretty different, and he was taking risks. Kumar's record. You mentioned 11 double hundreds. I think only Don Bradman scored more double hundreds in the history of Test cricket. I think his insatiability. So he just didn't give it away. 12 scores of over 200 Actually, just saying this, it does remind me of I had a rare experience of seeing Kumar get out first ball in a Test match, and Andy may remember this because he was coach. He was at Gaul in early 2012, and I think Jimmy Anderson nicked him off first ball to Matt Pryor. The problem was playing Sri Lanka in those days that if Kumar didn't get you, Mahela probably would, and he promptly scored 180, and Sri Lanka ended up winning the game. So if you got Kumar cheaply, you might still end up losing against Sri Lanka, but he ground the opposition down and always did it very elegantly, and as Andy said, sometimes eloquently from behind the stumps too.
Lovely, lovely stories, Lawrence. Thanks very much, Andy and Kumar Sangakkara, our latest inductees into this special edition. Looking back in time, of course, you are from the modern era. So let me thank you both for your time. I know you're busy people. Lisa Staleka, you were always as interesting with your comments and your research. Lovely. And thanks to you. And also Lawrence Booth, our editor of Wisdom. Great stuff from you, Lawrence. I look forward to seeing you during what will be a very busy English or British summer. So thanks everyone. Thanks all for your contributions, and congratulations, Kumar, and to Andy. So just to summarize this special ICC program, looking back on the different eras of cricket, the 10 new inductees, going back to the early era, pre-war, Aubrey Falconer of South Africa, Australia's Monty Noble. From the interwar era, Sir Leary Constantine of the West Indies, Stan Mckay of Australia. The post-war cricket era, England's Ted Dexter and Vinoo Manka from India. From the ODI era, Desmond Haynes of the West Indies and England's Bob Willis. And from the modern era, Andy Flower, Zimbabwe, and Kumar Sangakkara of Sri Lanka. 10 great players who have been inducted into the ICC Hall of Fame to coincide with the first ever, the inaugural final of the World Test Championship for 2021. Hope you've enjoyed this special edition. Till the next time, it's goodbye.